Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Lewis. I'm with the Eno Center for Transportation. Thank you, everybody, for dialing into the webinar this afternoon. We're going to be talking about Eno's most recent automated vehicle paper, Beyond Speculation 2.0. This is where we talk automated vehicles and public policy. And I have with me the co-author of that report and my colleague, Alice Grossman, who will be presenting with me the full paper and its recommendations. So Beyond Speculation 2.0 is the third in our paper, where we give the fourth in our series, where we give an overview of current automated vehicle policies and recommendations for federal, state, and local governments, as well as for industry on how to handle some of the most pressing challenges for vehicle automation. This is, like I said, the fourth in our series. We've been covering automated vehicle public policy for 8 years. It started in 2013 with Preparing a Nation for Autonomous Vehicles. This was a paper that we wrote alongside some very smart folks at the University of Texas at Austin that evaluated some of the opportunities, barriers, and modeled some potential scenarios for safety and for congestion relief. And we worked beyond that paper to create more and more recommendations for states and localities. And the interesting thing over the past 8 years has been watching the dynamic and the thinking on public policy change. And particularly, we've kind of identified 3 areas where we've seen a lot of change. And the first is, and this really comes through in our April paper, is a renewed emphasis on safety. And it's not to say that safety hasn't been a top priority, but when we look at how automated vehicles have deployed over the past, or policy has been talked about, it's been a huge emphasis on the first to market. And there was a belief for a long time that the first to market was going to reap a tremendous amount of benefits. That's been scaled back in part because of the 2018 Uber crash, along with other instances that have elevated safety and highlighted the fact that the American public has really zero tolerance for AV crashes or any AV safety issues, and we know that any AV crash makes international headlines. And in part because they want to protect their brand reputations, AV developers have been delaying rollouts, timelines to ensure that their technology is fully prepared. And so that has affected public policy and thinking on it. Another thing that's changed over the past 8 years is a growing fear of negative impacts. Well, when this process started, there was a tremendous amount of optimism that automated vehicles could solve a lot of the problems that have been really pressing the industry for a long, long time, including safety, congestion, parking, pricing, things that we haven't been able to solve through traditional methods. Perhaps autonomous vehicles can come in and change that paradigm. But especially in the last couple years, research is coming out that contradicts some of that initial optimism, and particularly on the state and locality front, there's been a growing fear of negative implications, and basically increased congestion, increased VMT, increased emissions, and whether that's founded or not, that's something that has certainly come up and affected public policy. And the third one, and this is certainly reflected in our report, is we've changed from a approach for public policy that was intended to largely be proactive to one that's being more and more a wait-and-see approach. And an example of that is in the liability and insurance areas. A couple years ago, there was kind of widespread agreement that government needed to get out ahead of the technology, put a framework for liability, put a framework for insurance in place before deployment, so that these technologies would know what kind of operating environment they're entering into. And this is something that we've recommended in past papers, but we've updated that to a more current thinking, in part because of delayed timelines and because of a better understanding of how the policy framework works, is doing things that are too preemptive might mean that we would be rewriting a lot of laws a couple years from now, if and when AVs are actually deployed, and we have an understanding of actually how they work. So a lot of the policy recommendations are much more setting up frameworks rather than putting out specifics that allow for the adoption of a future technology that doesn't exist right now, and can kind of be adaptive to that. And so it's with those three changing dynamics that we put this paper together. Again, going through some of the current state of play, the paper outlines current state of play for the federal government, for states and localities. We're not going to go into all of that because we don't have the time on this webinar, but it's certainly all written down in the paper, and we can answer any questions that you have about it. But we structured the paper around 16 key policy areas, and these are areas that come up a lot in conversation. Each one of these has a few pages of text where we kind of do an analysis, and we have some specific recommendations, some targeted at the federal level, others targeted at state and locals, and others targeted at industry itself. And while we're not going to go through each one of these, I'm going to hand it over to Alice, who's going to pick through some of the ones that we feel are the most compelling and the most interesting, and we look forward to answering your questions on them. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alice.
Great, thank you, Paul. Got it. As Paul mentioned, we're going to go through a couple of these key policy areas that we touch on in the paper, and some of those are more at the federal level, some of them are more at state level, some of them touch down even to the local level. You can see there's a wide range of topics that we covered. Today we're actually just going to focus on 3 of them in our webinar. We're going to look at safety certification, we're going to look at infrastructure investment, and we're going to look at funding. So starting out with system safety certification, when we have automated vehicles on the road, we're looking at this in a framework very similar to the existing certification process that we have. Vehicles need to conform to the federal FMVSS, the Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. And so if you're looking at automated vehicles, those automated driving systems are also going to need to meet some sort of standards and some sort of certification process. If you think about this in the SAE framework that we have with the 6 levels of automation, levels 0 through 5, that gives us a standard framework to work within. So even if this isn't necessarily your ideal way of classifying automated vehicles, looking at these levels of automation can help us figure out how we want to go about certifying an automated driving system, which is a little bit different than the FMVSS that we have for the existing vehicles right now that all require a driver in the vehicle. So in a sense, you can look at those those 2 base levels of 0 and 1 that have very little automation in them as pretty much what we have on the road right now. Those are covered by the current policies and current certification process, and we can stick with that. But then once you get to levels 2 through 5, it gets a little bit more complicated. So as Paul mentioned earlier, some of the crashes that we've seen with vehicles that have these automated driving systems have really brought a level of awareness to how we need to be measuring safety. And a lot of that is also driver education and making sure that we are able to make sure that people who are driving the vehicles, whether that's a driver inside the vehicle, if it's a remote driver, whatever that system is, are aware of the safety impacts and how the vehicle is operating and how the systems within the vehicle operate. So figuring out even at that level 2, where you have to have a driver in the vehicle at all times, making sure that that awareness is there and that the vehicle and the driver, the operator, the manufacturer, wherever that communication needs to happen is something that we've seen crashes already due to a lack of awareness, education, communication, and that's something we need to make sure we work on. Then it gets even harder when you get into the level 3. Level 3 vehicles, in theory, you should be able to switch between automated driving systems controlling the vehicle and a person manually controlling that vehicle. This gets very complicated because while we might be able to figure out how to certify an automated system, we might be able to figure out how to certify a licensed person. When you're talking about switching back and forth, we have very little research done in that area. There was one NHTSA report that has come out in the last couple of years that looks at that transition period. If you're going from an automated driving system, how long does somebody need to get back into the awareness to be situated in their driving environment and be able to handle the vehicle on the roadway and the situation that they're in, and then vice versa also, then switching back to the automated driving system. So that's something that if we ever end up with level 3 vehicles on the road is something that is a specific area of research and safety that really needs to be examined further. And as I mentioned, NHTSA has started on that, but there's certainly more research to be done in that area to figure out how to set safety standards there. Then when you move into the level 4s and 5s, it gets a little bit clearer again. You really need to be looking at a performance-based certification process for these driving systems. We're not setting recommendations for exactly what performance level they should be performing at, but somebody needs to figure that out. Where are we setting those standards, and then how are we going to measure them, and what safety standards are we going to set? Another thing that we really need to think about when we're looking at the safety certification process is that there's been a lot of discussion, and if you look back into the last 2 reports that we had looking at the differences between federal policy and state policy, this discussion of preemption and whether or not we're going to end up with a patchwork of laws in all the states, which is going to make it really difficult for manufacturers to get those vehicles on the road. It'll make it difficult for interstate commerce. So making sure that we're able to set up a certification system that's nationwide and that we have those safety standards for vehicles across the country and we can facilitate moving between the states. We also need to think about when we're looking at these technologies, maps updates, software updates, etc. And so figuring out if a system is certified at one point in time, how are those updates going to be accounted for? And are we requiring the manufacturer to do that? Are we requiring users to do that? Are we going to recertify every update to the software? And so looking at those elements is also a new element of system safety certification that we think NHTSA needs to be examining and address, and something that is ongoing still. So moving on to the next policy area that we're going to focus in on, infrastructure investment. This one is particularly important because it's probably one of the least automated vehicle specific policy areas that we have in this paper. One of the great things about infrastructure investment for automated vehicles is that it is also infrastructure investment for non-automated vehicles and all other road users, people in transit, people on bikes, people walking. So one of the things that we've seen about a lot of the automated driving systems is that they need cues from the environment. Not necessarily connectivity, but they're reading the signage and they're reading the markings, just like we do as drivers. And it's difficult for a person to figure out where the lane markings are if they're completely worn off, just as it is difficult for a computer to figure out where the lane markings are if they're all worn off. So figuring out how we can invest in infrastructure to support that advancement of the automated technologies is also going to support general transportation safety and state of good repair. And this is another way we can look at sort of that difference between public and private investment. While a lot of this technology investment is coming from the private sector, if they're going to be operating on public roads, then this is something that the public sector needs to be thinking about. And so kind of transitioning out of that, you can look into the funding options. If we need to invest in our infrastructure, as many of you are probably aware, if you've been reading Jeff Davis in Eno Transportation Weekly, we have a infrastructure investment problem right now. So figuring out how to get those funds to be available is something that we're working on. The Highway Trust Fund is not getting us to where we need to be. So one of the advantages to introducing these new technologies and new modes is there's a political feasibility in the funding structure that we don't have when we're trying to restructure our existing transportation system. So if we're putting a new type of vehicle on the road, we can look at new funding structures to go along with it. Introducing all of this at the same time, it creates a feasibility that might be able to really bring in an amount of funding for that infrastructure or other needs that are going to come along with automated vehicles or other elements of our transportation systems. So we looked at some different funding structures, and what Eno recommends is to put a 1 cent vehicle miles traveled tax per mile on these automated vehicles. That is moving towards this VMT funding structure, something that people have been talking about for a long time. It's not something that we have seen implemented on large scale in a lot of places. There have been pilots across the country, and I'd recommend people checking out some of those. But one of the nice things about introducing this along with the automated vehicles is that it's not really a change to the existing structure, but it's the introduction of a funding structure along with the new technology. And to look at some of those examples, actually, the state of Oregon has been doing a pilot for a long time, but then also in the context of automated vehicles, you can look at the state of Tennessee, and they did pass a law looking at that as well with the 1 cent per mile tax, and then I think it's 2.6 cents per mile for vehicles that have over 2 axles, looking at that wear and tear on the infrastructure, tying it back to that infrastructure investment element of the policy areas. So those are just a couple of highlights of the recommendations that we have, and if you take a look at the full report, you can look at all of those other policy areas that we had listed a couple of slides back. I would highly recommend you do that. We are looking forward to all of your questions. We've got a bunch of questions coming in, and we will go to those now.
Yeah, so for folks on the phone, there is a question function on the GoToWebinar control panel. You can please type your questions in there, and we'll be going through. There's already a bunch that have come in, and we will be happy to take them as they come in. So one question, and I'll ask it to Alice. Does the paper address AV benefits or detriments to the senior community, especially for senior communities in low-density areas? And if so, can you spotlight 1 or 2 points?
Scenario planning, or trying to figure out modeling for the future use of automated vehicles, depends on a lot of things besides the technology introduction. And so I think this is a question that we don't yet know the answer to, but there's a lot of possible outcomes. So if you think about automated vehicles being introduced, and there's still this question of, will it be shared fleets? Will it be personal ownership? And how are those transportation patterns going to change as we introduce automated vehicles? The answers to all of those questions is going to have an impact on how this new technology has an impact on people who, on older adults or people in rural communities. So I think there's certainly a lot of opportunity to provide new access and new mobility options, but then there's also needing to take into account equity issues and how accessible from a cost standpoint services or vehicles may be. Paul, do you have anything to add on that point?
Yeah, so you know, our approach in the paper was not to get into some of the specifics because there's so many unknowns. We recommended that localities and states put together some statements of principles on some of the kind of outstanding AV issues, so that instead of creating legal frameworks, they can demonstrate to the public that they are thinking about these things, and they can demonstrate to industry that they should take them seriously. But we didn't go into some of the specifics.
All right, so the next question we have here is about the expectation of policy scenarios and when technology might be adopted. So I'm going to throw that over to Paul.
Yeah, so we talk in the paper towards the beginning, not about when we think the technology will be deployed, but when we hear that major companies think it's going to be deployed. And this is where we find a lot of competing theories. Some people believe that the technology is a long, long ways off. In fact, we heard Uber's CEO talk a week or two ago, saying that, you know, automated vehicles that really can perform widespread robo-taxi service on their platform won't be available for at least 15 years, which is a long ways away in terms of how we plan and roll out transportation. On the other hand, We have a lot of people that are very bullish, and they believe the technology is going to come out very soon. And they point to over $100 billion invested in AV technology over the last couple of years as evidence that there's real money behind this that believes it's going to happen. And, it's not just a whim. The bottom line is that we can't predict the future. So all of the recommendations in here are designed to prepare for an unknown future and set up policy frameworks so that if and when they are deployed, we can be prepared for them.
I also will point all of you towards Table 2 in our report, which looks at when different organizations, manufacturers, tech companies are predicting rollouts of different levels of automated driving systems. And so I think it's really interesting in this report. One thing that I have also found enjoyable is if you go back and look at previous reports, either our Eno reports or also other researchers' think tanks from previous years, you'll see these timelines kind of scooting along as the publication scooting along, which kind of goes back to one of the points Paul was making at the very beginning of this webinar, that you see a change in how people are looking at the rollout of both technologies and policies as we move forward.
So another question here, it says that you mentioned FMVSS requires a driver. Is that technically true, or is it just implied? It seems pertinent to the regulatory demarcation between federal and state policy. Alice.
So the FMVSS, yeah, I have not memorized them all, but I'm pretty sure that might be right, that it's more implied. And so there's a lot of, Paul, do you actually know?
I don't know.
Yeah, okay. So we can go back and check on that for you guys. But one of the major elements that is being re-examined in the FMVSS is this implication, and it's that, you have to have a steering wheel that has to be a certain size, and you have to have brake pedals, and it's more of all of the parts of the vehicle. We're certifying vehicles, we're not certifying drivers. Driver licensure is at the state level. And so it's the implications of how the vehicle is manufactured and the safety feature that it holds and how that is interacting with a human driver within the vehicle. And so that's what really needs to be readdressed is if, we have a steering wheel for steering purposes, the performance of that steering is not necessarily going to be determined by a person holding a steering wheel if you have an automated system doing the steering of that vehicle. And in some cases, people are arguing that we might not want all of those parts in a vehicle because we can optimize safety and efficiency in a lot of ways if we aren't building around a system that isn't in line with the system being used.
Yeah, well said.
All right, let's go on to the next question. Going back to the funding topic. 1 cent a mile would equate to 25 cents per gallon gas tax. The question revolves around whether or not this is going to substitute for a gas tax. Is it a new charge? How do we see an overall funding structure, maybe at both the federal and state levels?
Yeah, so our proposal in the paper is a penny per mile fee on automated vehicle driving. So basically highly automated vehicle driving. So 3, 4, or 5 vehicles. And so if you owned your own personal vehicle, and you were driving it around, and as a normal driver, you wouldn't be charged. You got on the freeway, you're taking a long commute or a road trip, and you flip the automated system on, and you sit back and relax, then the fee would start applying. And the reason, or I guess the other way is that if it's an automated Uber that's going around a downtown area, in that case, it would be collecting that fee at all times. We don't necessarily see a phasing out of the fuel tax. We didn't talk about that too much, but this is a new charge, not on existing driving, but all automated driving in the future. And the benefit there's kind of 2 benefits that Alice talked about earlier. One is that there's no existing constituency because automated vehicles don't exist. And the other benefit is that the administration of an automated vehicle fee is way simpler than a VMT fee on the broader population, right? As of right now, if you were to put a VMT fee on all the cars, you'd have to have 275 million different taxpayers all paying into the system. But for automated vehicle driving, you're having a company that's doing the driving, whether that's Uber or Waymo or Ford or any other major company. they're going to be doing the driving, and so the point of collection for that fee is actually a few dozen automated vehicle developers rather than millions and millions of automobile owners. So we think that it's a compelling idea, and we kind of put that out there as it kind of behooves us to consider this, and we think that if we put this in place now, we'll be thanking our future selves when we put something in place that will always be part of the system, rather than trying to tack something on later once it's already an established network.
Yeah, I would just add on to that. Another element that we touch on in the report, and that I think is related, is whether or not these vehicles are likely to end up being electric vehicles, as it is also. And so starting off with that vehicle mile traveled fee instead of the gas tax, as Paul said, eliminates the need to re-examine this moving on to the future, and especially as we see higher penetration of electric vehicles in our fleets, either automated or not, moving on to new funding structures, I think could be a worthwhile endeavor. Great.
So another question is it possible that AVs will be restricted to only higher quality roads?
So I think this question actually could even go broader in terms of various types of infrastructure, whether it's high quality roads, arterials, specific speeds. And so if you look at examples now, you see these low speed automated shuttles have been piloted across the United States and Europe, and actually in multiple places around the world. And those are an example of an automated vehicle that have a very specific operational design domain, that they have to be operating on low-speed roads that cross low-speed roads. There can only be a certain amount of, bicycle or pedestrian or other activity on the roads that they're operating on. You've got to have very specific infrastructure requirements for them to be able to map out where they're going and actually function. So I think it will really depend on the technology to a certain extent, what those operational design domains end up being, and what level of infrastructure, both in terms of quality and just in terms of typology, that we're going to see these vehicles operating on.
Well, one of the questions that we often get is from states, and they're basically asking us, how do we as a state encourage more AV development in our state for the economic benefits and everything that comes with that. And when we ask the AV developers, whether it's a traditional company or a tech company that's trying to develop this technology, what should we be looking for? They always say that what they're looking for is a state that has high quality roads with good lane markings, few potholes, and clear signage. They're not looking for fancy connected technology. They're not looking for anything more than that. They're looking for just well-maintained roads that their technology can actually see. So whether or not it's regulatory restricted to higher quality roads, it may be a de facto outcome, because that's most capable of seeing, at least for the time being. So a question for you, Alice. So does the paper look at or forecast modal shift or modal equality? For example, if roadway vehicles get regulatory relief or priority for automated operations before a railway or another type of facility?
We don't specifically do any modal modeling, since this is more of a policy-related paper, but this does actually touch also on the issue of freight, which we haven't really talked about yet. And we do address in the paper looking at freight implications and automated vehicles, both from passengers, but then also looking at trucking. And that certainly would have an implication for rail, depending how that rolls out. And again, infrastructure needs and pricing and all of these elements going into it, that at this point we really just don't have any answers to that. We can just set policies that we can see as working towards national economy and safety and et cetera, and those goals that US DOT and the rest of us are trying to reach. And then in terms of passenger modal shift, again, I think it really depends on what the operational design domain ends up being and what the policy is shared versus personal ownership in terms of, are we in areas that already have low transit coverage, in which case it's going to be hard to really take people away from transit, and lots of options.
Yeah, I mean, right now when it comes to modal autonomy, it is very modal in that sense. And if we talk to railroads, we did not include railways on purpose because the regulatory structure is just completely different. The railroads are working on some type of automated systems, but their policy issues are completely different. They have a lot to do with labor agreements more than they have to do with federal policy. And railroads already have a tremendous amount of automations through positive train control and those kind of features in place. And I think the other thing to remember is that transit systems have been automated for a long time, whether it's the Vancouver SkyTrain, which is a completely automated transit system that moves hundreds of thousands of people every day, or one of our favorites is the SkyTrain at Atlanta Airport. That moves, I think, over 100,000 passengers every day, and that's been automated since the 70s. And so there is a tremendous amount of automation already in transportation. One of the most challenging is on roadways where you have so many dynamics, and that's what makes it both compelling and challenging at the same time.
All right, well, we are actually already past 4:30, so in order to be respectful of everybody's time, I think we will point you towards our report to answer the rest of the questions that have come in. And if you go to our webpage at enotrans.org, the first box you will see that pops up is Beyond Speculation 2.0. You can go ahead and click on that and download the full PDF of the report. And I think that actually answers a lot of the rest of the questions we didn't quite get to. At our website, you can also sign up for Eno Transportation Weekly, which is an invaluable source for all things transportation policy. And thank you all very much for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.